If it's Boeing, I'm not going.
The company's flagship product, the 787 Dreamliner. But this footage reveals some have little faith in the plane they build.
Did you fly on one?
After a mid-air emergency forced an Alaska Airlines flight to land.
I was supposed to pick them up, said one passenger's father. This was my daughter.
62-year-old John Barnett found dead on Friday.
The gaping hole.
You are grounded, Missy.
Hello, I'm back. I have a bit of a back injury, a minor back injury, and I'm feeling a bit off this week. And suddenly my external monitor has decided that it doesn't want to work anymore. So a lot of things are going on, but we're going to do our best to work through this very intriguing story and discuss some larger implications. Boeing, it's a name with great esteem. I remember the first time that I heard of Boeing, it was in Jay-Z's Encore when he says, Boeing jets, Global Express, out the country, but the blueberries still connect. And I was like, that sounds really cool. I wonder what a blueberry is. And recently I found out he meant to say blackberry. He meant to say blackberry, and a blueberry is just a fruit, not a thing, not a technological thing. Anyway, Boeing has been a name that is at the forefront of aviation, at the forefront of production for the military, the almighty, venerable US military for many a year, and has recently attracted so much negative attention that people are starting to say that they will outright avoid flying on Boeing planes. You will see a lot of this type of content on TikTok especially. And yes, there's the facts of Boeing being a main manufacturer for the US military, which is bad, right? US military bad. We all agree with that, right? And them being involved in a whole bunch of unseemly political lobbying. But aside from that, the planes also seem to not be working very well. On the 5th of January, right when the new year started, when everybody's thinking about good things happening, an Alaska Airlines flight had a door blown off while taking off, and that led to an injury for a man named Quang Tran. I'm going to tell you his story very quickly. Imagine you're ready to start the new year off. You've got this important flight to Ontario, California, which is a place. You're cozy, you're tucked in, you've got your carry-ons tucked in, you've got your baggage already done. You know how stressful flying is these days. You wouldn't want to worry about some bad things happening on a flight. And now we're finally ready for takeoff. Everything's calm, cool, and collected. And as you're taking off into midair, things are going well, and suddenly a row in front of you, the door blows off. Tron said, the captain said we had passed 10,000 feet, then the hole blew out on us, and I remember my body getting lifted up, then my whole lower body got sucked down by the howling wind. That feeling of no control is pretty terrifying. The suction was so strong and I was hanging on for dear life. Both my shoes ended up getting sucked out. I had my shoe on pretty tight too. My phone, which was in my hand, disappeared. So the plane made an emergency landing. Everybody ended up okay, although Tron ended up with a laceration on his leg. And also trauma. And that was just the tip of the iceberg, the beginning of a fantastic and event-filled first quarter for Boeing. Let's run down some of the other events that have occurred, shall we? This is from Newsweek, by the way. On January 13th, a Boeing 737-800 operated by Japan's All Nippon Airways was forced to cancel its takeoff after a window in the cockpit cracked. Simple enough. 5 days later, Atlas Air, flames coming out of a Boeing 747-8 over Miami. Flight had been bound for Puerto Rico but was grounded after the crew detected an engine failure. 2 days later, Delta Airlines, an incident taking place at Atlanta International Airport with a 757. It was taxiing on the runway to prepare for takeoff, and its front nose wheel fell off and rolled away, leading to a delay. February 6th, a flight bound for the Bahamas was reported to have experienced stuck rubber pedals, prompting a probe from the National Transportation Safety Board. On March 7th, okay, we're getting a month of separation now, that's good. A 777-200 bound from San Francisco to Japan was forced to reroute to Los Angeles immediately after takeoff after one of its wheels fell off. What's going on with the wheels? LATAM Airlines, March 11th, this was a big one. A 787-9 Dreamliner bound from Sydney, Australia to Auckland, New Zealand, experienced a mid-flight technical issue that resulted in the craft dropping mid-flight, injuring 50 people on board.
This morning, new video from inside that plane, which shows what happened in the moments after this Boeing 787 Dreamliner suddenly plunged mid-flight, uprooting passengers from their seats, tossing them around the cabin. One passenger describing a scene reminiscent of the The Exorcist, as passengers who had removed their seatbelts during the previously calm flight flew out of their seats, slamming their heads on the ceiling.
2 days later, March 13th, United Airlines, a 777-300 from Sydney to San Francisco, was forced to turn around and land where it started after a fuel leak was reported after takeoff. United Airlines, again, March 15th, a 737-800 bound from San Francisco to Medford, Oregon, arrived at Rogue Valley International Medford Airport, thank God, with an exterior panel missing, having seemingly fallen off during the flight. So parts are falling off of planes. Planes don't seem to be put together very well. And hopefully the investigation that's ongoing from a few years back is going quite well so we can get to the bottom of this. And oh, what's that? There's a whistleblower who has died of a self-inflicted gunshot wound right before testifying in a key moment. This whistleblower worked for Boeing for more than 30 years. His name was John Barnett, and he was a person who had great understanding of planes and had constantly been raising issues with the stuff he was working on, and was going to come forward talking about how workers had been put under pressure to deliberately fit substandard parts to aircraft on the production line. That's from BBC. What's that? This has been an issue for multiple years, not just this year. Yes, indeed. There's a Netflix documentary called Downfall that's about this case against Boeing and how they produced their 737 MAX plane, which we'll get into. There's also a recent John Oliver piece about Boeing, which if John Oliver is doing a piece about your company or industry, just know it's too late. You've been dunked on, and a plethora of different formal and informal coverage about Boeing. But there doesn't seem to be a lot of coverage about the stuff that I think is the most important. The stuff that I think is the root of the issue at Boeing, and it's going to make you roll your eyes a little bit, I'm sure. But bear with me here. Capitalism. In this video, I want to talk about the history of Boeing a little bit more and examine some of the coverage that Boeing has received in the midst of this ongoing crisis, wherein they've had all of these different problems with their 737 planes and problems internally in terms of how they have shifted from quality to not quality. And I want to talk about how this is a normal and natural thing under the way we organize production and economics. And if that doesn't change, which obviously it's not going to change immediately, but if that doesn't change, then this kind of thing is just going to continue happening all across the board in far more industries than just aviation. And not only that, but I want to talk about why that's important to talk about. I want to talk about what philosophical inquiry into capitalism and its effect on these things can actually allow us to do when we talk about these things, and allow us to see in terms of how we approach fixing these problems. But first, I want to talk about another company, a company that'll never do you wrong, Delete Me. This video is sponsored by Delete Me. Everybody knows that I have a bit of a public platform, and I've always wanted to do a better job of protecting my online safety. This is something that's quite important to me, but I wasn't sure where to get started. Thankfully, today's sponsor, Delete Me, offers a very useful service. It can help delete your data from the internet by checking around for websites that store your personal information and taking the time to remove it. You see, speaking of shady people with bad motives, there are these folks called data brokers who collect personal info from all types of places and then sell them to seedy websites. If you don't take the time to get that info removed as much as possible, you may be at risk of harassment, identity theft, and stalking, among other things. Especially when you express sometimes political views online like I do. Those can be serious threats. I recommend Delete Me because it addresses these issues very simply and effectively. I found the sign up process to be straightforward. I didn't really have any issues understanding what to do or understanding the UX or how the process works. And I love how communicative and available customer service is. I encourage you to protect your personal data with Delete Me, and now you can use my coupon code SANG to get 20% off of all US Delete Me packages, including ones that can help your family as well as yourself. You can also click the link in the description, join deleteme.com/SANG, and get straight to protecting your data. Thanks to Delete Me for sponsoring this video, and let's move on with the show. We open with the story of Lion Air Flight 610, which took off on October 29th, 2018, and crashed into the Java Sea in Indonesia 15 minutes after takeoff, killing 189 on board. The plane, a 737 MAX, met its demise due to a confluence of factors. And these many factors are discussed and analyzed in a pretty cool New York Times 2019 feature called What Really Brought Down the Boeing 737 MAX by a guy named William Langewiesche. This is a handsome white guy who has many awards for writing books and articles. And in particular, as you're about to notice from this piece, if you read it for like 5 minutes, he was a pilot once and takes a lot of pride in that. A lot of the writing that he's done in recent years has been based on his aviation knowledge. But the thing about this feature, the prose is really good. There's a lot of really interesting technical detail outlined in the piece about how flights work, how planes work, how flying is supposed to work, all of that. But it ultimately comes away with a very weird narrative about why this plane crashed. And not just that plane, but also a plane that crashed 5 months later, also a 737 MAX in Ethiopia. And as an important detail, the flight that crashed in Indonesia killed 189 on board, and then one person who died afterwards trying to save people in the water. The Ethiopian Airlines flight 302 crashed 6 minutes after takeoff, and that killed 157 people. So here's my thing about William Langewiesche and this New York Times piece. It seems like because of his personal connection to the matter of flying and the pride he takes in once being a pilot, he can't help but take this into a very personal direction. And despite the fact that he's outlining all these different disastrous conditions that the pilots had to face, in many instances caused by Boeing and its, let's say, incompetence, Langewiesche ultimately decides that the biggest problem that led to these crashes was bad airmanship. The pilots were bad. If good pilots flew these planes, they wouldn't have crashed. You get a feel for this early on in the piece because he starts talking about how the pilots lack an essential quality known as airmanship, and that the worst of them are intimidated by their airplanes and remain so until they retire or die. It is unfortunate that those who die in cockpits tend to take their passengers with them. Okay, Bill Langewiesche. There's been a lot of critiques of this piece from other very qualified aviation writers. In particular, Ilan Head of the Air Current describes it as the last stand of an obstinate pilot who, resolutely ignoring both 7 decades of human factors research and the questions raised by his own reporting, is determined to ascribe 2 complex tragedies to personal failings. Yeesh. I love that description because I think it really gets at the heart of what's so frustrating about this piece. It's got this cognitive dissonance to it. Langewiesche is describing, for instance, Boeing as a corrosive agent that spreads money around Washington, pushes exotic weapons on Congress, toys with nuclear annihilation, sells all sorts of lesser instruments of death to oppressive regimes around the world, and dangerously distorts American society in the ways that President Dwight D. Eisenhower warned against in his prescient 1961 farewell address. That on top of talking about how there were issues with the spare part that led to the crash in Indonesia, and issues in terms of the very, very, very important MCAS system. The MCAS system, which stands for the Maneuvering Characteristics Augmentation System, was a feature that was added to the 737 MAX to account for some of the construction difficulties. The aerodynamics of the plane were kind of off, and that caused the plane to stall more frequently than it should. Stalling basically just means when you're trying to go upwards in a plane and you can't keep going upwards. There's an issue where the wind pressure is just not allowing you to do so at the angle of attack that you have. So you just kind of start drifting off, not getting any movement in midair. So you're just kind of like almost falling, facing upward. And to correct that, pilots have to basically turn the nose back down, gain momentum, get the wind back into your flight, and then move back upward. That is such a good description. I'm so good at describing flying. MCAS basically automated this process, knowing that the stalling was going to happen a lot, so that pilots, I guess, wouldn't get worried or whatever. And so it would turn the nose down whenever it sensed from one angle of attack vane that it was going to be stalling. And if that angle of attack vane was wrong, because there are problems with parts, then it would just start nose diving, basically for no discernible reason. And that was what happened in the flight in Indonesia. Oh, by the way, nobody at Boeing told pilots about MCAS. There was no training that was assigned so that pilots knew that if the plane was stalling in midair, that the plane would have a mind of its own and suddenly start doing this. But it was the pilot's fault. The pilot's fault because they didn't know this thing that nobody taught them about this plane. And this 737 MAX was meant to compete with the new Airbus A320 model, which is its main competitor. And the difference between Boeing planes and Airbus planes, according to Langewiesche, is that Airbus planes are so well automated that there are very little things you can do to mess up a flight. You can basically fly it with very little training and experience. That's like the big bragging point with that plane, whereas Boeing planes ultimately are still designed for the pilots to be the last line of defense. And this is a bit of a questionable choice considering the fact that most plane crashes that do occur, and they occur very rarely to all the folks who are scared to fly watching this video thinking they'll never fly again. I understand you, but plane crashes are still very rare. However, when they tend to happen, it's because of pilot error. And when we have this technology available to make this less and less of a necessary thing, then good, right? Langewiesche, not so hot on it. And what's especially kind of insulting about this piece intellectually is that Langewiesche multiple times talks about how the public is clamoring for this simple answer. It's such a simple answer to just blame systemic issues, blame Boeing for being a bad company that poorly designed these planes and caused these plane crashes. When in reality, we have a much more complicated answer, which is, you guessed it, that the pilots just sucked. What a powerful, nuanced, complex answer. So much more complex than analyzing why systemically this company was driven to act more and more in favor of profit rather than in favor of safety, talk about these economic systems that influenced it, talk about what kind of internal safety changes need to happen in terms of regulation of planes. No, we'll just talk about how pilots bad. Pilots are dumb. He actually uses the word dumb. He uses the word dumb. He uses the word incompetent. He uses the word weak at one point. This is his big response to the overly simplified answers that we supposedly seek. And I can't imagine a more simple and weak sauce answer than that. Why plane crash? Because pilot bad. Like, are you kidding me? Part of it seems to be this old man shakes fist at cloud thing where he's like depicting himself as part of this old guard of pilots who knew how to deal with equipment failures, who were competent in all the aspects of the plane. Although, as the aforementioned journalist Elon Head notes, even if pilots of an earlier era had superior stick and rudder skills, they still crashed airliners at a rate that would be unacceptable today. What really gets me is like, okay, so let's say we just accept this narrative. Pilots are just bad now. They're not like they used to be. What do we do with that information exactly? Like, what's the conclusion then? What's the call to action? I mean, there's not really anything looking like a real solution-based answer that involves real systemic change from Langewiesche in this piece. It's just almost like a lament. It's almost like a boo-hoo, this is so bad. If the problem truly is that pilots nowadays are checklist children, as he describes them, who come out of a production line, then shouldn't we ask whether we should change our pilot training systems? Shouldn't we ask who's in charge of pilot education and why aren't they doing a better job? This could be a great transition into a conversation about de-skilling, which is something that the socialist scholar Harry Braverman talks about in his book, Labor and Monopoly Capital. De-scaling is basically the process by which, over time, as automation occurs, as technology advances, as companies become more sophisticated in their production processes, that workers become less and less necessarily skilled. So pilots, for instance, are less and less skilled because nowadays they don't have to know all that much to be able to fly a plane because the technology is all there and done for them and their jobs are more simple. And this is something that is described in all types of professions all across the board, from office jobs to industrial jobs, conveyor belt jobs, all these kinds of things. And maybe there can be some debate as to how true that is, but I could definitely see that being a potential issue. Pilots are no longer trained to understand their planes as intimately because so much of the stuff is automated, and they're definitely more susceptible to be in difficult positions when a plane experiences a difficulty that can't be easily addressed by the automation in the plane. totally understand how that could be a critique. Braverman in this book notes how Taylorism, which is a style of scientific management that became super popular in the 20th century, basically trying to pump out as much production as possible by simplifying everybody's job. This is the standard all across all these different workplaces and in education systems, as we talk about in our video about schooling. Taylorism specifically develops technology to the demands of capitalists rather than workers, and then the capitalists systematically de-skill workers. They make the workers less and less skilled and knowledgeable at their jobs through their own training so that they can be paid less and less to do the work, so that they can have less bargaining power, so that they can have less of a say over the production process, etc. Think about it. If you work on airplanes now and you don't have to have the same amount of skills you would have in 1960, you might be getting paid less now, as many complain that they are, and you might be much more easily replaceable, because you don't have to have so much intimate knowledge that takes a lot of training and education to acquire. And in addition to that, because the technology advances, which is supposedly a good thing, and advances specifically at the interest of the capitalists, then that means that it advances with an interest specifically in bringing the capitalists more profit, which means that, making workers less skilled, but also dividing the skills. So you have a whole class of workers that understand the design parts and the management parts of creating, for instance, these planes. And then you have this whole other subset and class of workers who used to be in that position as well as doing the boots on the ground stuff, but now they just do the boots on the ground stuff, which is becoming increasingly simplified, so they're much easier to replace. As Braverman writes, the more there is to know, the less the worker need know. So while Bill Langewiesche is lamenting all of this as a crying shame, right, as this big problem about how pilots just don't have airmanship anymore, they're just not smart, tough guys like they used to be, he could be using this as a pivot to talk about systemically how capital has worsened pilots, right? How the system is making us less and less understanding of what's going on in these planes and leaving them into the hands of people who by and large are more interested in profit than anything else, whereas workers used to be in that position far more before. And this comes back to the fact that capitalists own these industries, they own the production processes, and so they dictate what the production is about. But instead we just, kids these days, they don't know how to fly planes, which is great. That's great. So the problem with Boeing is capitalism, but nobody seems to get it yet. When you watch content about the problems at Boeing, they're going to give you this specific grand narrative. Once a great company at the forefront of aviation, this corporation has been subsumed by a toxic culture, predicating profits over people. It's a shell of itself now. By the way, what an odd story. What an oddly familiar story. I really like John Oliver's piece about this, but I also think that this narrative is a bit reductive and a bit annoying at certain points. And it's not totally his fault, but this is a good opportunity to talk about some of the things that John Oliver did not talk about and the bigger picture stuff. So for instance, the big narrative says we can pinpoint the downfall of Boeing to the year 1997 when it merged with McDonnell Douglas, which is like the evil, ugly, goofy company that Boeing was not. It represented the complete antithesis of what Boeing had achieved. And now it had subsumed, and pretty soon it would corrupt Boeing through this merger. It's an interesting narrative. I think it's a very valid narrative in certain respects, but we need to zoom out a little bit. It's an interesting narrative. I think it's true in a lot of respects, but it certainly can't be pinpointed to that moment. We need to zoom out a bit more. Peter Robison's book, Flying Blind, which is one of the sort of pioneering pieces of media, one of the pioneering books pushing that narrative, finds that Boeing actually started to lose its reputational grip in the mid-1980s. Its 737 jet started being in the model that people needed more because it was narrower, it was smaller, so airlines wanted more of those to accommodate increase in flight demand. And it was also being confronted by huge competition in this upstart European company, Airbus. I wouldn't even say it was upstart, but it was definitely bursting onto the scene at this point. And it dropped the A320. When Airbus dropped the A320, it was like when Kendrick dropped the Control verse. It was like, uh-oh.
It was cool for what it was, you know, and I'm just into making, like, my thing is, like, I like lasting power, you know, that's my thing.
And Boeing is Drake in this case. And Boeing was like, you know, I think you're doing a lot. I think you're doing a lot, and you're kind of stepping on my shit now, and this isn't very classy of you. The A320 in particular was this narrow body plane, and it was also far more automated. Like I was talking about before, you had a lot more of an effort to simplify the flying process, and it was also known to have this quite comfortable cockpit for pilots as opposed to the Boeing. Apparently, it was a great place to eat lunch. Even then, we can trace back issues earlier to government deregulation, which is usually the problem in these cases, isn't it? But it's not quite as simple as the usual when the government stopped regulating things, everybody went bad. It was more so that planes were really expensive in the 70s and people wanted to fly more and more. And government regulations were part of why. And in 1978, the Airline Deregulation Act removed government control over fares, routes, and market entry of new airlines, introducing a free market in the commercial airline industry and leading to a great increase in the number of flights, a decrease in fares, and an increase in the number of passengers and miles flown. The girls are flying. And this is part of why there was this change in consumer behavior, that people wanted smaller planes now. Really, airlines wanted smaller planes to accommodate how many more people were flying in all these different places, as well as contributing to the airplane market being more globalized. So the A320 is taking off, no pun intended, and the Boeing 737, which was kind of an afterthought at first because Boeing was like, people are always going to want our big ass planes. They no longer wanted the big ass planes, so the 737 and its small ass self started to get rushed out in production. Newer models of the 737 started dropping like flies, not like flies, dropping like selling like hotcakes. What's the term that I'm trying to use here? The 737 planes were being produced more and more, even though Boeing didn't pay as much attention to it, and oftentimes these new models were kind of rushed out, and so there were design flaws. In the early 90s, there were 2 crashes, one in Colorado, the other in Pittsburgh, which already signaled that something was wrong. In this case, a faulty rudder design, which Robison saw as the first evidence that the 737, coaxed into new iterations across the decades, was being stretched beyond its own limits. Shortly after this time period, Phil Condit became the CEO of Boeing during what is seen as the beginning of its decline. Now, who is this guy? Is he some hotshot venture capitalist? Is he some South African blood diamond heir who just wants to put his imprint on things? That's the type of guy that would come in and ruin a great company like Boeing, right? No, he was a Boeing guy. He knew a lot about planes. He was actually really influential in a lot of Boeing plane designs. He cared about quality. And he also was somebody that it's not superiors, it's because it's the people who work underneath him. Somebody whose subordinates really respected as being much more interested in their input and much more interested in being flexible than previous leaders of Boeing. He also was a weirdo who married his first cousin at some point. But it was under him that Boeing continued to produce these not so amazing 737s without addressing core issues in the plane design to keep up with Airbus, which led to the eventual iteration of the 737 MAX that ended up, as you know, crashing in Indonesia and Ethiopia because nobody wanted to talk about the system that they just dropped to accommodate even more design issues that they had. Airbus was cutting into its market share, and Boeing was more and more compelled to have to compete with it to gain those profits back. And that was part of what drove it to buy McDonnell Douglas, right? Because at that time there was a big 3, there was Boeing, there was Airbus, and then there was McDonnell Douglas, and McDonnell Douglas was the ugly duckling. Nobody liked McDonnell Douglas. McDonnell Douglas has so many issues with producing its planes. They had all these crashes, they had all these greed issues, the company's dwindling all over the place by the early 90s, but it was still the 3rd biggest company. And on top of all of that, here's something that nobody really talks about. In 1993, the Pentagon holds a meeting that would later be called the Last Supper, in which soon-to-be Secretary of Defense William Perry urged all these different military contractors, including Boeing and McDonnell Douglas, who were both producers of really important planes and other stuff for the military, you know, stuff that we kill around people with in this country. He urged them to start consolidating, essentially, because the military budget was dwindling a little bit developed after the Cold War, and the defense budget was interested in savings, essentially, and was like, we're not trying to dole out all this money to all these different companies when some of y'all are not even big time like that. Like, you all think you're Boeing, but you're not. And this included other military contractors too, of course. It included folks like Lockheed Martin and all of those folks. And it was right after this meeting that Boeing and McDonnell Douglas began to negotiate in earnest. When the merger eventually happened, it brought the leader of McDonnell Douglas, that's the name, it's a long ass name, MCD. It brought the leader of MCD to a significant leadership position at Boeing. His name was Harry Stonecipher, and he was a piece of shit. He only cared about profits and was weird. At the time, this acquisition was seen as a boon for Boeing. It was seen as this great thing. Everybody was talking about how great this would be for Boeing in terms of its bottom line. Even the European Commission was trying to stop it from happening in an antitrust issue because they were concerned about how this would ruin competition in the market for Airbus. And yes, from this point onward, this is when the culture started to change a lot at Boeing. A lot of people will say this. Stonecipher and his infinite wisdom about how you should spend your money on buying back shares to make investors profits instead of, I don't know, investing it in making better planes. All that stuff starts happening at Boeing. But there was a series of conditions, a series of things that led to that happening in the first place. And they all come back down to things being owned by people who care about profit. For a long time, Boeing built this reputation as caring about quality over profit because it didn't have to worry about getting its primary profit from investors globally or from market issues. It was from a very early point onward, this extremely favored company by the American military, who blessed Boeing with a ton of money that allowed it to then invest into dominating the domestic market, dominating commercial flight. This insulated Boeing from having to worry about making profit like other companies, essentially, for many years. But especially as neoliberal capitalism started rearing its ugly head more and more, especially as military spending became a bit less sizable than it had been for a long time, Boeing was like, oh shit, we need to make more money. So they started doing everything bad. Its leadership didn't randomly turn corrupt one day. Phil Condit, the weirdo that he is, was a Boeing guy. He was a genius aerospace engineer. He was compelled to buy McDonnell Douglas because, by and large, everybody thought it was a good idea. In terms of its market share, in terms of it growing as a company, this was one of the main things it had to do, and it was getting pressured by its number one customer, the American military, to do so. And so when I see talking heads like John Oliver, who, you know, as a fellow brunette man with glasses, I respect you, John. That's not a thing. And so when I see talking heads like John Oliver, who I like him a lot, I like his content a lot, or I see people on the r/Boeing subreddit clamor about needing new leadership at Boeing, I just have to laugh because it's like, what do you think is going to happen? Literally, this didn't start with just bad idea leaders who didn't know anything about planes. It started with people who were competent about planes and also needed to take profits because capitalism is about profits. That's what the whole system is dictated on. Companies like Boeing and societies like ours don't change because we just had a bad run of bad guys in important positions. They change because they are based on producing things for a small group of people to make money. Coverage of Boeing's crises, whether it's John Oliver's thing, whether it's the documentary, whatever, can be pretty good at pointing out the basic facts of the story, at pointing out important details at times, at getting across simple, important narratives about how bad some of the leadership decisions have been. But ultimately, it misses the bigger picture problem of why these decisions were made in the first place. And this is a thing you could do all the time with all this different type of social analysis that people will have about why companies go bad, about why society has problems or whatever, is instead of having this easy turn towards bad guy did bad thing, why don't we analyze why the decisions were made from a practical standpoint? Why don't we use the word why? Sure, pilots might not be up to the challenges they're facing. But why produce planes that apparently leave a bunch of pilots less than qualified to fly them? And why do pilots not get the time and education and resources necessary to fly these planes? Sure, Boeing's merger with McDonnell Douglas was a big turning point in making the company greedy and lazy. But why did they merge with McDonnell Douglas? Why would this amazing culture that they built over the years suddenly subside so easily to this random outsider company they just acquired? Sure, Boeing needs new leadership. But why has it suddenly had this long streak of bad leaders over the past few years, despite being the big successful company it is, with a clear blueprint of why it's successful? And why would a new leader change what is clearly a bigger issue than Boeing itself? I'm sorry to break it to you all, but only when we analyze capitalism can we start answering those questions. When capitalists own the means of production, they get to determine how the production happens. They determine why things are produced. They don't care if the planes are bad, if they're making money, if they're taking profits. That is their goal. And the more monopoly power that they have over the market, the less they have to worry about consumers giving bad feedback. Or in this case, consumers dying, which is the ultimate bad feedback. They can operate the same way that gaming companies do. We'll just put it out there when it's close to finished, and if there are issues, we'll iron them out after people complain, or die, or lose their shoes. And once every single thing you might want or need is owned by people who prioritize profit, the same recklessness you'll get from Paradox Interactive about the new Cities Skylines game is the same recklessness you'll get from Boeing about the plane you have to fly in. This is the case in everything that has been commoditized, which is to say everything. It's the case with our health and the healthcare industry. It's the case with housing and food. And the idea that society thrives when there's competition is a myth. In this case, Boeing didn't get so bad until they had competition. It was the competition from Airbus that pushed Boeing to change its practices so that they could extract more profits at the expense of the consumer. Why? Because the goal of the game, the goal of the competition is not to make better stuff that people like. The goal of the competition is to make profits, because capitalists own what do I have to say it again? Capitalists own the production process. They own the stuff. It's their game. And especially in these cases, this idea that we can vote with our money whenever a company messes with us, whenever a company does stuff we don't like, just looks hilarious and inane. Because especially when Boeing has so much of the market share through stuff that has nothing to do with consumer behavior, and thus can basically ensure that you're flying on a Boeing plane at some point in your life multiple times. Anytime you want to fly, that you're quite likely to get a Boeing plane. There's not really a choice in the matter. And furthermore, as long as they're making profits, they won't care what you have to say. In conclusion, please stop waiting for good capitalists to come around and fix bad capitalism. Please stop blaming issues like Boeing's on capitalism gone awry. It's not gone awry. It's doing the thing it's supposed to be doing. The system works as intended. The purpose of the system is what it does. And what the system does is kill people. Oh my God! My audio. Oh what the What the I did it again. I'm sorry, Babilla. I'm gonna get your money's worth this song. Oh, I'm sweating. I'm so sorry, Babilla. I'm not gonna touch the wire anymore. Ooh, my right hand is starting to... Oh, I gotta switch to the left hand. I hope that didn't cause an issue. It did not. Okay. Oh, it's not even the... It's their game. Shit, bro. What the fuck? Oh, don't do this. Don't do this. Babilla, we're gonna get this right. I'm so sorry. Thanks to our channel members for supporting the channel. You can join and donate $5 a month to become a channel member and receive access to amazing emojis and also bonus content. So thank you all, and I'll see you for the next one.